All right, everyone, welcome back from lunch. Our next program is Emerging Issues in Industrial Animal Aquaculture. I'm still too tired. And I'm going to turn it over to Tessa from that.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, to our third session today. Like Megan said, it is Emerging Issues in Industrial Animal Aquaculture. I am Tessa Gonzalez. For those of you that don't know me, I am the Director of Research and Impact at Aquatic Life Institute, and I'm very, very happy to be joined by our panelists today. So this panel will discuss various developments and opportunities to challenge the rapidly evolving aquaculture industry. We'll have about 10 to 12-ish minutes for each of us to present on a variety of topics, and we're going to leave some time for a moderated Q&A at the end, as well as ample time for audience questions. So first up, we have Tom Appleby, Head of Governance and Legal Affairs at the Blue Marine Foundation. Tom is a non-practicing solicitor qualified in England and Wales. He is a member of the Center for Architecture and Built Environment Research, where he leads on environment and sustainability. Tom is also a member of the International Water Security Network, the Environmental Law Unit, and the United Kingdom Environmental Law Association. Beyond UWE, Tom is Chief Legal Affairs Advisor to UK-based ocean conservation charity, the Blue Marine Foundation. So Tom, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, does this work? Oh, yeah, good. Huh. I'm also, I didn't put on there, I'm also a recovering real estate lawyer. And this is very much a real estate law take on this. And I can just say that from commercial property management real estate point of view, the situation with aquaculture is generally dreadful, actually, because we don't think of this as renting out bits of the sea which are public property. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. We plunge straight into the science and the regulation, and we haven't focused on who owns the sea. And so that's what I'm going to talk you through now. So it is the semi-quinquennial anniversary of the independence of the United States of America. So I put a picture up of King George III. And it is quite important because, unfortunately, because of the British colonial legacy, we have left an outsized imprint of the UK constitutional approach to the marine environment across the globe. And that is problematic because it sits somewhere in what's called prerogative soup, how the sea is owned, how the sea is managed. It was never quite defined, and there are other parts of the world, Papua New Guinea, for instance, where local communities owned their inshore environment, and Scotland originally, actually, owned their inshore environment, controlled their waters, and did something not akin to aquaculture. And they understood how their inshore environment were owned. They were communally owned inside the reefs or inside the locks, as they were in Scotland, and managed what we would call a kind of extensive kind of aquaculture. So, unfortunately, the British Crown, the British colonial legacy is not great on this. So what I'm going to look at is who has the power, what are the extent of those powers, what are the sort of normal terms of engagement that we have when we're renting out aquaculture leases at sea, and what are the obligations which flow from that. And there are substantial obligations which flow from the Crown ownership, in our case, of the seabed, and possibly federal ownership in other places, because ownership is the key here for me. So what you first start off with here is something called nemo dat quod non habet, which is you can't give what you don't own in Latin. So you're looking at who has the power to rent out aquaculture. Now, traditionally what happened was under the common law system, the seabed is owned by the Crown and there are public rights of fishery and navigation that trundle over the top. Note, getting a several order where you privatised a bit of inshore sea either had to happen prior to the Magna Carta, because the Magna Carta legally disabled that to happen, or you needed to get a notice under the Shellfish Act, which is incredibly difficult. And a single objection can lead to a public inquiry which costs in the region of £250,000 to do, just to set up a shell fishery. Hence, it is incredibly difficult to set up inshore shell fisheries inside the UK, even though we've got some sustainably productive fisheries that have been going for well over 1,000 years. So take one is that bit needs to be sorted out. But when we're coming to salmon aquaculture in UK waters, that came about because a series of cases. The first two cases are interesting. Crown Estate Commissioners and Fairley Yacht Slip. And here you had some moorings that were being put up by the local harbour authority that were rented out, and boats were berthed on them. And the Crown decided that they were going to take them on because they owned the seabed, they owned the moorings, and the moorings were outside of the public right of navigation. And the court held that that was the case. And what that did, and see, that's only 1979. We've been a maritime nation for a lot longer than that. The aquaculture industry is based on that case. So they said if you can rent out boats attached to chains to the seabed, then you can rent out fish farms. There was no other statutory investigation into that at the time, and it still remains a pretty weird law. So much so that I can't pronounce this, Properties Limited, which is the property company of the Earl of Dundonald, acting as clan chief of the MacDonald clan, he took the Crown Estate to court when they tried putting up a fish farm in waters where he had the baronial salmon fishing rights in the sea, and forced the Crown to revoke its lease. It never went to court. I only found this out because he invited me to tea in his castle and I was rummaging around in his basement. And then he kindly gave me permission to look at the court papers, which is a sort of, lawyer. I couldn't believe the fun of the whole thing. It was just great. But it was like, so that's a really interesting thing. We have no statutory framework sitting behind the lease of these things, which is why they're so controversial. You ask people why it's controversial, it's because it kind of came about without the usual processes you'd expect. And then there's some great Canadian cases here. You've got Alexandra Morton's case, British Columbia, and this case was a case where the provincial authorities were regulating the fish farms. Turned out it should have been the federal Crown. It's a new activity. They didn't know who regulated it. You had a bit of what would be called competence creep in the European Commission of a local agency taking it on when it actually belonged to the Crown. They had to do all sorts of stuff to rework their licensing system in Canada to make sure it was the Crown rather than the provincial authorities renting the leases out. It also had an amazing test inside it called the Man on the McDonald's Bus, which was not a test I was used to. And I was thinking in the context of this case what that would be, because surely we don't, men, I'm sitting, it would be the wrong thing, but I was thinking maybe it's the being on the bus test they should have used. We might have had an even more interesting thing. But as it was, this was seen as being outside of the provincial government's responsibility, fell on the Crown. So they redid all the legislation. And here is another very similar case, which is the Namgis First Nation versus Canadian Ministry. We heard that some First Nations were supportive of salmon farming in Canada. This is a group of First Nations who were most definitely against it. And this was a case of smolt transfer licensing from the facilities on shore into the sea, and it infringed the First Nations fishing rights, very similar to the Dundonald case that I mentioned earlier, and therefore the license was set aside. So this is really important because this is the sort of, when I look at it from a lawyer's point of view, this is the base building block of what we do. We come with the science and regulations later on. So what are those? Sorry, let's go on to this one. Yes. So the way leases are drafted this is just using Scotland as an example. England has a slightly different regime. There is a statutory responsibility under the Crown Estate Act, Scottish Crown Estate Act 2019, to maintain and enhance the value of the estate. And that includes responsibilities for sustainability and the environment. So when we were talking about an unregulated industry in the first place, or patchy regulations, the ultimate responsibility for what goes on in Scottish waters, if it's not regulated, it's the responsibility of the Crown. If something goes wrong, it's their fault. And that's recognised in how this works through the leasing system. So what you normally have is a lease from the Crown to the fish farm operator, and that will include things like rent, user clauses, the sort of things you would expect. But there will also be environmental obligations. There will also be animal welfare obligations sitting in there too. So if you find it's not working on the animal welfare bits are breached, then it's also a breach of the lease from the Crown. But it may also be, and this is my contention, I'm having some discussions with the Crown Estate in Scotland at the moment, that the obligations contained in these leases are far stricter than just complying with the regulations. And the reason I say this is it's totally normal in property law. If you think of it, if you're renting a building out to a tenant, when you rent that building out, it isn't just about them complying with planning permission. It is about them making sure the building is painted every few years, it's restored, it looks nice, that basically the asset is maintained. And my worry with the way a lot of the aquaculture leases that I've seen have operated, these clauses are just not being enforced. And what that does is it puts the liability back on the public owner. So a really good example of this is Greece, where I think there's over 150 redundant sites after the operators have gone bust or gone bankrupt, which then falls back onto the Crown, which is actually the Greek public, to have to pay for the restoration of these things. Now, that would never happen in any other environment that I've come across where there's a commercial operator. Normally, I put the end of this as a requirement to reinstate at the end, and if they don't look like they have enough money, and I would query with even very large aquaculture companies whether they would, there should be an environmental bond to secure clearing up afterwards. So there's a lot of stuff, basic Property 101 stuff that's just missing routinely across the sector, which it's a new sector. I can understand how that's come about, but it kind of needs to grow up. It's my sense on that. And then the Crown isn't completely off the hook there either, because it's in operations along with its tenants. It's basically very much the way the leases are drafted there. They are essentially like partners to the operation. They are also equally liable for noise, and when we reduce employment on that, these things can get, they can become incredibly noisy, which affects people. They've got pollution. There's genetic pollution, which can affect other people's fishing rights. So there is a whole series of obligations which sit there that if they're liable to the operator, but they're also the liability of whoever granted the lease in our system anyway. It would vary across the world. And so there are other obligations as well, nuisance. They've got to, if they don't enforce their lease terms, they're in breach of their statutory obligations. I go back to that Section 7 I mentioned earlier in the Crown Estate Act. If they don't do that, then they could be sued for failure to do so. So you've got this, there is this tension in there that my worry, as I suppose, is that we're dashing to the regulations and we're not necessarily think we have a high degree of control. And if I take a step out of that, I think we have to have a collective think about what we want to do with our fishery and whether we want extensive or intensive aquaculture and how that's going to go together. I just don't think we've had that conversation. There's something called, I heard this term earlier on this week, which was the Olympic approach to granting the tenancies on these things, which is the first person with the loudest voice gets a tenancy. That is absolutely not how we do property management anywhere else in this sector. So that's me.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. I'm just curious, you mentioned the noise from fish farms in this last bit. What do we currently know or understand about those impacts of underwater noise on aquatic animals and surrounding ecosystems?
Well, two things. Well, the people are part of the people affected. There's tons of stuff on noise. I mean, all building sites are regulated on how much noise they can make. Industrial activities aren't allowed to operate between certain times of day. Fish farms routinely operate 24-hour systems. They have feed guns blasting away. So the human side, there are real problems there, and communities up the west coast of Scotland have kind of really started to get impacted by this. On the marine noise side, I mean, I'm not the person who asked. I've got a colleague, Steve Simpson from Bristol University, who's the expert on aquatic noise. But what we do know, and there's probably some expertise in this room actually, is that herring basically are an ear. That's what they do. So any noise, depending on the type of species, it's going to have serious impact on different species. But even crustaceans are meant to be affected by noise now that we're understanding. So what you're looking at there from a legal point of view is whether that's regulated or not. When you come back to if I go back to my thing on the Crown does actually have to look to those broader implications of what's going on when it's granting a lease on these things, even if it's compliant with the noise regulations. But the noise regulations, as I see it, are quite a long way behind it because the science is quite poor.
Thank you so much, Tom. We're going to move on to Abigail Penny. She is the Executive Director of Animal Equality UK. Abigail heads up Animal Equality UK, an international animal protection organization defending farmed animals. Under her leadership, the charity's hard-hitting undercover investigations into factory farms and slaughterhouses, legal advocacy campaigns, and public awareness actions routinely garner mainstream media attention, including coverage on BBC Panorama, The Guardian, The Times, The Mirror, The Daily Mail, and more. Current UK campaigns include a push for a ban on the importation of foie gras made by force feeding, a call for heightened legislation for farmed fish at slaughter, a focused effort to halt Scottish aquaculture expansion, and a drive for increased oversight and enforcement of animal protection legislation. So, Abby, over to you.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to be talking to you about an emerging new form of factory farming and how I believe actually that we have a rare opportunity to stop it before it becomes entrenched and normalised. So recirculating aquaculture systems, or RAS, are fully enclosed on-land salmon factories. They're highly problematic since, as we've heard earlier today, salmon are migratory animals. They have this very powerful biological drive to move between rivers and open ocean, and in RAS farms, they spend their entire lives in highly crowded tanks. We're talking about 10 times the stocking density in a sea cage under artificial lighting. The system requires them to navigate these very extraordinarily complex systems that are made up of filters, pumps, generators, biofilters and valves, all in order to maintain this chemical balance and all of the temperatures that are necessary for these animals to just survive. It also requires vast amounts of energy, fresh water and chemicals. And I think Mark here, who is a leading fish expert, he's an innovative agriculture specialist. This is Dr. Mark Borthwick, who said that raising fish in this artificial environment is like placing them on a spaceship, where even the smallest human error or equipment failure can kill every single animal on board. And the risk profile is incredibly dangerous across multiple fronts. So when it comes to animal welfare, as I mentioned, migratory animals in permanent confinement in extreme densities with chronic stress and compromised immunity. When it comes to disease, the Fish Health Inspectorate has notified us that 26% of controlled freshwater mortality events are caused by fungus alone. So smaller water volumes, this very complicated equipment, all of the little nooks and crannies that are there, they're a perfect breeding ground for these new and novel types of pathogens to take hold. When it comes to feed, as we've heard earlier today, that is a really huge issue, and it still continues to be one inside RAS. So around 400 wild fish are consumed for every single salmon that is being farmed because they are carnivorous. It relies on industrial trawling, with all of the bycatch and all of the destruction that comes alongside that. This problem still exists in on-land farms. And then when it comes to pollution, every ton of farmed fish in a RAS farm produces the equivalent of 80 humans. There are nitrates and there are phosphates inside their feed, which then is in their effluent, and that is highly toxic to the local waterways and to all of those individual animals within it. No filter, of course, is 100% perfect. Every single filter has some level of failure state. And if these fail, but just the tiniest amount, it will absolutely decimate the local wild animals. And as you can see here, this was actually back in 2023, leaked footage that Animal Equality received from a Maui worker who was wading through inches deep sludge from effluent tanks that had spilled out and overflowed. On energy, RAS is also the single most energy-intensive way to farm fish, 1.5 times more than sea cages, and a 5,000-ton site uses as much power as 3,400 homes.
Wow.
On chemicals, the list continues, I'm afraid. So huge volumes of chemicals are needed to avoid that fungus that we spoke about from forming. So one site, actually, called Barcaldine, was actually caught by the environmental regulator for having dumped Olympic-size worth swimming pools of volume of carcinogenic formaldehyde and bronopol for 117 days consecutively into a local loch, which I went to visit myself and took a little water sample of. I was having a nice Erin Brockovich moment. And we know that I saw for myself, there are dogs there are children swimming in these local lochs. This is incredibly dangerous. And these risks are completely proven. We already have fully RAS sites internationally that are already in existence. And when it comes to Scotland, there are hatcheries where they're rearing juvenile salmon using very similar equipment. And they frequently are experiencing mass mortality events. So in Florida, 500,000 died due to an issue with the drum filters. In Denmark, 100% of the fish died due to a fire. In Canada, 100,000 fish died due to a structural collapse in the biological filter. And there have been reports of nitrogen levels spiking, tanks exploding, equipment rupturing, and errors made during routine worker maintenance. Animal Equality actually recently secured a landmark ruling from the Information Commissioner's Office, which is essentially the government watchdog, forcing the Animal and Plant Health Agency to publish its inspection reports on salmon farms in Scotland after it refused to give them to us on the grounds that it would negatively impact their ability to manage their reputation and protect their business. But we did get hold of those reports because we are a persistent bunch. And as a result, we found a catalogue of failures and mass hidden deaths that had otherwise never been disclosed. So at Inchmore RAS Hatchery in Scotland, operated by Maui, which is Scotland's largest salmon farming company, over 100,000 fish suffocated after a worker left them unattended and their oxygen supply failed. In a separate incident in the same month, a buildup of hydrogen sulfide killed another 1 million fish in 10 hours. And the Animal and Plant Health Agency took no enforcement action. The list goes on, I could tell you about these all day. What makes all of this particularly alarming is that there is effectively no enforcement regime in place whatsoever for RAS. So the regulatory framework for the existing sea cages is already dire. The Fish Health Inspectorate has never prosecuted a fish farm. It's also never refused an application for one. And the Animal and Plant Health Agency has inspected just 2 farms in England over a 5-year period. It's voluntary to declare the deaths in Scotland, and in England, those deaths actually go completely unmonitored and undisclosed. Since RAS represents an entirely new form of factory farming, there is actually no comprehensive regulatory system in place at all, and this is very different to sea cages, meaning there are no reporting requirements and no effective monitoring. This technology is still very much in its infancy, and yet there is an attempted rollout without any meaningful oversight or infrastructure. So we've actually been fighting against RAS for several years now. The first fully on-land salmon farm was proposed in northeast Lincolnshire. So we went and visited, spoke to the council, made our warnings and our objections made clear, but the vote still went ahead, 7-4 in favour of approving the farm. They actually mocked us and I think thought we were just these kind of crazy radical activists. But they did this without an environmental impact assessment, despite the farm's proximity to the Humber Estuary, which is a protected wetland. So we applied for a judicial review and we were successfully granted that, and only 5% of cases make it to the High Court, and ours did. And we argued that they failed to properly consider animal welfare or to recognise that they could if they wanted to. So following a 2-year battle, a High Court judge did uphold the committee's original decision, But our case does seem to have stalled it by 2 years, and I'm hearing little whispers that they are now really struggling to get any financial investment or support, and really are not looking attractive to investors at this stage. The ruling also established something really important in planning law, that animal welfare can be a material land use consideration, and so it can be used as a reason to block new farms. That's not just salmon farms, that's any. And so Communities Against Factory Farming, a fellow NGO, have already been using that ruling to block a puppy mill and to block a factory farm. So all of this begs the question, which I'm sure you're all wondering yourselves, why in the world would anybody try to farm fish on land? Well, the answer is that the Scottish salmon farming industry is in a total state of crisis. As was mentioned earlier today, waters are warming, jellyfish blooms, algal blooms, intensifying lice infestations, they're all driving catastrophic mortalities on existing Scottish salmon farms. Last year, we discovered that 12 million fish were reported to have died, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many more that are hidden from us. And in 2023, over 17 million salmon died on Scottish salmon farms, which is the highest ever recorded, up from 16.7 million the year before. Maui actually reported operating losses of nearly £1 million in Q4 of 2023, and the industry blamed El Nino for this, which is a weather pattern that makes the waters warmer. But we're already seeing reports of a super El Nino on its way this year, so we know the writing is on the wall. It's actually become so dire that protests have erupted, with anglers, conservationists, local communities, animal advocates, even some workers are now speaking out against this industry, and many now are calling for, at the very least, a moratorium on the industry's expansion. And just months ago, a Scottish Government Advisory Committee wrote to the Cabinet Secretary warning that it is disappointed that across key areas of its inquiry recommendations, progress in future-proofing the salmon farming industry has not occurred with the urgency called for. And the committee expects to see sites with persistently high mortality to be regulated effectively, and doesn't agree with the analysis of the Scottish Government that this is not a systemic issue. It also went on to say that without actually improving these things, the Scottish Government risks eroding public confidence. These are very strong words coming out from a Scottish Government Advisory Committee, which we lobbied hard over the past year. So the industry will inevitably look to flee the crisis that it itself is also fueling, but is being also fueled by warming waters, lice, and disease-ridden seas. But in doing so, it risks replicating the same welfare and biosecurity crises on land in potentially an even more fragile and less regulated system. And finally, just as some kind of positive words for you to end on, is that actually we do feel we are really being heard here. So not only did the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee take on board many of our concerns and genuinely deal with us in a meaningful way, we also know that the UK government's December 2025 animal welfare strategy explicitly acknowledged RAS farming for the first time, and it's now instructed an advisory body full of experts called the Animal Welfare Committee to look into this matter and advise them on the welfare of farmed fish during their lives. This is definitely a direct consequence of sustained advocacy from animal equality, but many, many others as well. And I also want to look to France. I think this was referenced lightly earlier, but a government advisory body has told ministers the science is insufficient when it comes to RAS and that the risks are too great. And this is completely due to the exceptional work of a group called Systemic. There are now calls for a 10-year moratorium on RAS, which is backed by a coalition spanning environmental, health, and animal organisations. So there is some optimism on the horizon. And that is that from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby. I'm curious, what lessons from terrestrial intensive farming are repeating themselves with onshore aquaculture facilities?
Yeah, it's a good question because I don't only work on farmed fish advocacy, even though I am slightly obsessive over it because it's particularly bad. But I often liken it to chicken farming because I think many of the conditions, they might look different, but actually the exploitation from these industries is very similar. You know, they're really pushing these animals to the absolute brink. They're trying to get them to grow as fast as they possibly can in conditions that are so very far from their natural wild instincts or habitats. They're also under artificial lighting that then is messing with the seasons that are in their mind or their circadian rhythms. And it's just completely unnatural. I think it's this drive for profit at any cost. And I think the animals are just being completely left out of the conversation. So as a result, we know that chickens now are Franken chickens, where they're suffering from heart attacks and lameness and lung issues because they're growing far too quickly in too short a time. I think we're seeing very similar issues with fish now, where they're not biologically even close to what they once were, and they're just being pushed way too hard in conditions that are completely unnatural.
Thank you so much for that. It's my turn now. So today I'm going to talk about AI in aquatic food systems, and I just want to preface this by saying in no way am I an AI expert, but I do very much recognize how AI will change our area of expertise now and in the coming years. So this is a really important issue that I personally find very intriguing, but there are a lot of pros and cons to consider very carefully with AI in particular. So AI-driven technologies in aquaculture include machine learning, computer vision, the Internet of Things, which I still don't entirely understand, automation. All of these are transforming industrial aquaculture by enhancing efficiency, sustainability, and productivity. So like Abby just mentioned, really pushing things to the brink of productivity for productivity's sake and profit's sake. So while innovations can be beneficial for improving aquatic animal welfare, especially related to automated monitoring, for example, it's imperative that we weigh the pros and cons of this emerging technology carefully, as there are welfare risks, substantial welfare risks, that can be overlooked in the face of optimization. So I will quickly touch on current use in aquaculture related to AI technologies, the various opportunities and risks, and then leave you with perhaps some responsible governance that we can consider moving forward. So in the very credible source of Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, and I think that rings very true for AI and aquaculture for us right now as advocates. In December, Rethink Priorities published How AI is Affecting Farmed Aquatic Animals, Part 1, that examined innovation. This was part of their series that looked at AI technologies being developed to address challenges in the aquaculture industry. And they uncovered around 91 companies that have developed AI-enabled technologies for aquaculture applications with potential animal welfare impacts. And all of these identified technologies are already on the market. Their paper found that more than half of all companies develop technology for stock and growth management, making it the most popular use case in this sample. Through my own research over the past several years, I've also come across various AI technologies in aquaculture related to automated water quality management that employs sensors to analyze real-time data on various water quality parameters such as oxygen levels, temperature, pH, and this allows farmers to take immediate corrective actions. AI-powered predictive models forecast fish health risks and environmental changes. These kinds of predictive analytics can enable farmers to anticipate potential risks, such as harmful algal blooms or temperature fluctuations. Robotics and computer vision streamline fish sorting, biomass estimation, and harvesting, which minimizes human intervention. AI-driven recirculating aquaculture systems, or RAS, that Abby just talked about, work to help conserve water and control waste. AI-powered monitoring systems utilize underwater cameras, sensors, and machine learning algorithms to track fish behavior and detect abnormalities. And computer vision technology, AI-driven pattern recognition systems can identify early signs of infections, parasites, or abnormal swimming behavior. And these machine learning models can analyze historical disease data to predict outbreaks. And this AI-driven automation can also enhance vaccine and medication administration, ensuring precision and reducing stress on fish populations. And then finally, smart feeding systems powered by AI optimize feed distribution based on fish appetite and biomass estimation, which reduces overfeeding and minimizes environmental pollution. So these are some various uses currently employed in aquaculture related to AI. Some visual examples of various technologies. So the top left, the iFarm, which I just enjoy the name, has been developed for Cermak by a startup called BioSort. And this uses artificial intelligence and machine learning to identify each fish in a net pen that allows for targeted health interventions, if required, and health records stored for each individual fish. And this measures various factors, including weight and growth rate of each individual fish. Lice is counted on the whole fish, and any wounds and signs of illness are also registered and stored in the fish's health record. The top right is Real Data's Real Weight, which is a biomass estimation camera and system built for RAS specifically and flow-through systems. The submerged camera system samples thousands of fish as they swim past, and AI then predicts the weight of each fish sampled. This produces a non-intrusive biomass distribution report for the farmers. The bottom left is Cage Eye Feeding, which is a smart feeding solution designed to optimize efficiency, consistency, and fish welfare. This is powered by AI-driven insights, and their feeding system ensures that the feeding strategies are tailored to the specific behavior and preferences of the fish that are observed, so they can overcome the challenges of more traditional feeding methods. And finally, the bottom right is Tidal's underwater vision technology and robotics that brings AI and machine learning to their aquaculture camera systems that provide data-driven insights for optimal decision-making, including, again, real-time biomass estimation, sea lice detection, fish welfare monitoring, and autonomous feeding. So these are just a few visual examples that I've come across. As mentioned, there are many, many opportunities and many, many, many risks associated with AI. A few of them for opportunities are these earlier detections of negative welfare states, which can allow the farmer to intervene in a more timely manner. Welfare monitoring at scale, especially for thousands of fish in a single enclosure. An improved understanding of animal needs, being able to analyze each individual fish's behavior and adjust accordingly. However, the risks are quite substantial when we take a step back and think about it as an industry. So, as mentioned in a few of the presentations today, a big risk is optimization for production rather than optimization for animal welfare and respect of the individual animals themselves. And this can lead to expansion and intensification of aquaculture, which is obviously the opposite of what we all want to happen. And then another interesting risk, I think, is that welfare metrics might be oversimplified or misinterpreted just because they are according to these behavioral analytics or various innovations. We still don't know what the animals are feeling or thinking, even though technology is helping us understand a little bit more related to their environmental conditions and the kind of states that they're in. At the end of the day, we don't know. So we should be careful for oversimplification or misinterpretation when analyzing the results from different AI technologies. So at Aquatic Life Institute, we have our annual aquaculture certification schemes benchmark, which analyzes various welfare criteria in some of the largest certification schemes. So we look at water quality, stocking density, environmental enrichment, feed composition, stunning and slaughter, and other prohibitions in each of these aquaculture certification standards. And something that we're actually working on right now with Natasha at LSC and the Jeremy Collar Center is thinking about how exactly we could perhaps introduce responsible AI governance standards or requirements into something like the certification benchmark, and looking at how certifiers respond to these kind of governance oversights related to AI and with respect to animal welfare. So it's important that AI systems used in aquaculture should be transparent, scientifically validated, and subject to independent review with very clear accountability for decisions that might affect aquatic animal welfare. These tools should be developed and evaluated against explicit animal welfare objectives, ensuring that productivity gains don't come at the expense of welfare outcomes, and that welfare indicators are incorporated into system design from the very beginning. And responsible AI frameworks should be developed collaboratively with researchers, industry, certification systems, policymakers, and animal welfare experts to support consistent safeguards, ethical oversight, and integration into aquaculture standards and certification schemes, as well as other governance mechanisms like legislation, for example. So these are, some of the initial discussions, but I think it's very important that we start to consider more and more realistically how we can implement appropriate safeguards into aquaculture governance related to AI and animal welfare. Thank you. And now I will introduce Amy P. Wilson. Amy is an attorney with over 15 years professional legal experience and is the co-founder and executive director of Animal Law Reform South Africa. She has worked on aquatic animal law issues for close to a decade, including currently as a consultant for the Aquatic Animal Law Project, Animal Legal Education Initiative at the George Washington University Law School. Amy co-founded World Aquatic Animal Day together with Professor Kathy Hessler, and is a co-authoring a book on aquatic animal law, science, and policy. So Amy,
thank you.
Over to you.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you haven't reached that dip in your energy after lunch, and if so, I hope I wake you up a little bit. It's really wonderful to be here with such fantastic co-panelists, and special thanks to the organizers. It's a really great event, and my talk is going to introduce maybe some weird ideas, but also build off on a lot of the really great discussions that have already happened today. So when we think about aquaculture, we often think about fish farms, salmon cages, and shrimp ponds, but aquaculture and its future are becoming far more complex than that, as we started to hear today. Debates extend beyond growth to questions about which species are being farmed, how aquatic animals are bred and managed, which products are being produced, whether animals are needed at all, and how emerging technologies may transform production. I'm briefly going to touch on several emerging technologies that are reshaping our aquatic food systems, from genetic engineering to novel species to alternative proteins and even space research. My focus is not on the viability of these or even all of the socioeconomic impacts, but really maybe some questions from an animal law perspective and a governance perspective that we can start thinking about. And I'm going through quite a lot, so because of time, I'm just introducing these at a high level to get us kind of thinking out of the net, if you will. So we know from today's talks that aquaculture is the fast-growing food system in the world. It's now surpassed wild-caught fisheries in terms of aquatic animal production. It indirectly and directly affects trillions of sentient beings. And that means that the future of animal agriculture and food systems and animal law is increasingly aquatic. Historically, as we've heard, fish and other aquatic animals have received a lot less legal protections, and this is, I would say, kind of across the spectrum compared to terrestrial animals, and as farmed animals, they also receive a lot less. But as we've also heard, scientific evidence is increasingly showing us that these animals are sentient and they have capacities that we as society deem worthy of protection. So the result is that we're in a fascinating moment where innovation is moving rapidly and governance is not keeping up. But that also means that the future of aquatic animal law is yet to be decided, and this creates, of course, risks, but also opportunities for those of us interested in multi-species flourishing. So, the first topic, designer beings, and I know Abby's also touched on this. One significant development is the increasing use of genetic technologies. Aquaculture, and indeed animal agriculture generally, has relied on selective breeding, but we're now seeing a growing interest in genomic selection, genetic modification, and potentially gene editing technology through things like CRISPR. The goal is straightforward: bigger animals that grow faster, that resist disease, that are less sort of vulnerable to warmer waters and require fewer resources. And from an environmental perspective, there could potentially be some benefits. They might reduce disease burdens and resource use. From an animal law perspective, we should be asking a different question, which is what happens when animals are designed primarily for productivity. We've seen in terrestrial animal agriculture how intensive breeding and genetic manipulation has caused severe and profound animal welfare and protection harms. And of course, there's various concerns relating to escapements, the effects on biodiversity, genetic manipulation, the control and ownership of genetic resources, and even things like consumer transparency. So we do have opportunities here to advocate for proactive reform, looking at issues such as GMOs, even including things like animal welfare impact assessments in environmental assessments before for genetically altered animals, ensuring that welfare becomes part of a design objective rather than merely an afterthought. Another trend is the expansion of aquaculture into new species, including just a couple of examples: sea cucumbers, sea urchins, jellyfish, and perhaps more controversially, and I know it's coming up later, octopus, among others. Drivers include things like food security, climate resilience, market demand, and diversification. Most regulatory systems were not designed with these animals in mind. Key concerns obviously include around ecological impacts, animal protections, but especially in these cases, the absence of species-specific knowledge and protections in our legal systems. So it does also present us with a rare opportunity, because unlike terrestrial animal agriculture and even some aquatic animals where these systems are deeply entrenched, we can take proactive steps, and we see this happening, for example, through preemptive bans in the case of octopuses. So we're not simply asking the question about how we can farm these animals, but whether sufficient scientific evidence and justification exists to farm these animals at all. So we can follow a precautionary and proactive approach. And aquaculture is also increasingly expanding beyond food production. I think we've spoken a lot about aquatic animals used for food, but in fact, aquatic animals are farmed for various reasons. Aquatic organisms are used in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, nutraceuticals, biomedical research, even as companion animals and in restoration projects. And like terrestrial animals, it creates governance challenges because we as humans regulate animals based on their usage. So farmed animal frameworks are different to research animal frameworks. And I think we also need to do perhaps a little bit of a better job to be highlighting this arbitrary distinction based on use characteristics rather than species-specific protection. So animals being treated the same in different contexts based on a species and their capacities basis rather than our own instrumental human use. Another interesting area and a big criticism we've touched on today of aquaculture is the reliance on wild-caught fisheries. Aquatic animals are caught as fish meal and as fish feed, and of course that has tremendous animal and environmental and social harms. And because of this, insects are increasingly being promoted as an alternative, both as feed for these animals and as food for humans and other animals too. So species include, just as examples, black soldier fly, mealworms, crickets, and silkworms. And of course, using insects can reduce pressures on wild systems and ecosystems and even other animals, including endangered species. However, from an animal law perspective, we should be asking whether we are solving a problem or simply shifting it over. And of course, if insects are in fact sentient and have capacities that we deem worthy of protection as advocates, and they can have positive and negative states, we are simply transferring this issue from one group to another, one that is even less protected than aquatic animals, and one where the scale is ginormous. The amount of animals due to the size of insects is tremendous, right? So just kind of thinking of it, the spectrum of issues that arise. So what are the alternatives? Well, perhaps the most straightforward and one which I think is the most desirable is to remove animals from the equation altogether. Plant-based seafood products are increasingly using, obviously, traditional products like legumes, but we see more and more fungi, seaweed, algae, and kelp used to replicate conventional sea products and even create new ones. So seaweed bacon, mushroom fillets, and coconut shrimps, right? Wrong one, sorry. Seaweed also deserves particular attention. There's a lot of really interesting research happening in this area. It has the significant potential to contribute to food security while requiring much less resources. It's not completely without harm, of course. Challenges include things like consumer acceptance, nutritional equivalence, labeling, etc. But from an animal protection perspective, plant-based alternatives really offer one of the clearest pathways for us to reduce the demand of farmed aquatic animals. And the legal opportunities allow us to go beyond regulation, including proactive support through public procurement, food strategy, and investment frameworks. And another alternative, although not completely without animal interference, is cell-based or cellular or lab-grown meat, if you will. Instead of raising and slaughtering entire animals, producers cultivate seafood directly from animal cells. These include products like salmon, tuna, shrimp, and eel, with more in development. Many challenges remain. I can talk about that a little bit more, but it's very interesting because it potentially shifts the conversation from just improving welfare standards to reducing animal use altogether. And therefore, we could potentially have a huge impact on a large number of animals. And there are, of course, governance issues that arise around naming, labeling, who controls them, government mandates, trade rules, regulatory harmonization. But it's where food law, animal law, and innovation kind of meet. And the last issue I wanted to touch on, which is kind of futuristic, but it also illustrates how rapidly this field is developing. Aquatic animals have been used in scientific research for a very long time, including in space-related research. Fish such as mummichogs, guppies, and zebrafish have gone into orbit. They've gone to the space stations. They've been studied for various reasons, but obviously now with the increasing interest in going beyond planet Earth, it's becoming more relevant. Researchers are exploring algae cultivation, cellular agriculture, and closed food loop systems for long-duration space missions. A project called Lunar Hatch is actually exploring whether sea bass could be farmed on the moon. So for animal lawyers, the questions and the lessons is broader because emerging technologies frequently create new contexts which animals may be used. And in fact, technologies developed for space are often finding terrestrial application. So we have the opportunity to ensure principles like the 3 Rs, among others, are put into our legal systems, governance systems, as we're looking at space law, for example, and following things like the precautionary principle. So although these technologies differ, the governance questions raise very strong similarities. How do we incorporate growing evidence of aquatic animal sentience and capacities into law and policy? How can we ensure animal interests are protected before these technologies and industries become deeply entrenched? How can we address the relationships between animal, environmental, social, and human protection? And how do we ensure that innovation is not only assessed in terms of productivity, but also in terms of justice? And as animal lawyers, I think we have some really interesting discussions to have, and we can be a lot more proactive in this. So those are some resources of some of the issues I've spoken about, particularly alternatives. And then just a quick sort of plug, next year's World Aquatic Animal Day is about some of these technologies that are arising and how they impact aquatic animals and specifically the law. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. Just very quickly before we open it up for questions, what barriers would you say are slowing down the adoption of seafood alternatives at scale?
Okay, yeah, so I think there's a lot depending on, I mean, the plant-based food sector and the cell-based food sector are a little bit different. I think things like consumer acceptance, right? This goes across to terrestrial products as well. For example, in the cell-based agriculture, they are not producing enough at scale cheaply enough, so they have a lot of like industry hurdles that they need to get through. They have financing constraints, things like that. There's a really good report from the Good Food Institute from 2021 called An Ocean of Opportunity, which deals with some of these issues from consumer industry perspective, and then of course from a governance perspective, because these technologies like cell-based food are so new, they straddle different departmental government mandates. So for example, in the US, they've had to enter into MOUs to decide like who regulates this product at what point. And I think that we're seeing that even in South Africa as well. It's just, there's such a lacuna in the law, and we really need to do a better job of like closing it before these products could get to the market.
Yeah, thank you. That was shrimply the best. So I think we have about 15 minutes now for audience questions, if anyone has a question. Ooh, we're tired. That's okay, me too.
Thank you. So one thing that I was thinking while you were talking about all these animals that died from a number of different problems that the facilities had. Usually those farms, they have insurance, and since we have someone who with civil law experience as well, maybe like looking at the insurance company perspective, because they do have to report the animals that died in order to receive insurance coverage. Is this something you've already looked into, if there's opportunity to do some work there? Because they get paid twice in the end of the day, right? When they lose those animals, and that happens with animals in disasters, land animals in disasters as well. They report these losses as property losses, and they do receive insurance coverage for that. And if there is any liability on their end, they will not receive insurance coverage for their losses. So is this, am I tripping? Is there opportunity there? Is this something?
It's a great point. I mean, there'll come a point when we're getting such serious losses in Scotland at the moment. There'll come a point where the insurance risk will be difficult. I wonder whether Greek farms can be insured, for instance, because the losses there are off the scale. The Greek banks had to take I think it was an 80% haircut or something like that off their loans to them when Avramar was sold to Cook. So there's some very wonky maths in some of these things, but I haven't really looked at the insurance. It's a great point.
It's a very good idea. It's given us, I think, a good campaigning angle now.
Yeah.
I have a feeling like, I think what will actually help end some of these industries is things like that, like kind of boring accounting things or just circumnavigating, trying to convince them that it's ethically wrong to confine migratory animals is probably not going to quite cut it for a lot of these companies, but actually kind of forcing their hand through these more like red tape, bureaucratic angles, I think is very smart.
Yeah. It's kind of, just on that, it's kind of arrived at that in that I think with the salmon farms in the early days, they kept going bankrupt, and then the only way you could run them was by having them at massive scale. So we have 4 salmon farmers at all in Scotland. That's it, really. There's 4 big companies that run the whole thing. Because each farm is so vulnerable, you can only do it at scale, because then you can self-insure. The losses would be so catastrophic if you're operating at a small scale that you wouldn't be able to do it. So there's something in there about self-insurance as well and how it operates, I think.
Okay, hi, thanks everyone. That was a really, really great panel. I learned so much. Tessa, my question is for you. So it was really fascinating to me that AI can be used to kind of individualize animals and recognize individual animals and their like behavioral and feeding preferences. So I'm wondering, so that's obviously how industry is using it, but like, could we as animal advocates also use it that way to like use AI to individualize aquatic animals and to kind of demonstrate that, you know, they are individuals and they have like individual personalities and preferences, and they're not just like, it's, even when we say fish, it's not just a monolith. So do you think there's like some potential there to use it in advocacy that way?
Yeah, I absolutely think there's potential to use it for animal advocates, and I think that it opens up an important point about collaboration, and whether that's among advocates in industry, which I know is a little interesting and testy at times, but even among advocacy organizations themselves. If there were different collaborators with different areas of expertise that wanted to proliferate this narrative that fish are individuals, and even the industry is starting to recognize that fish are individuals, and you can see that that is the case by these kind of iFarm individualized health records, which I don't even know where my health records are. So if we can start, just capitalizing on that narrative, I think that would go quite a long way with where we are currently in the industry.
Hi, I had a question for Tessa. This is with regard to AI, and I wanted to understand from your perspective, since the technology is growing way faster than our ability to keep up with it, do you think scoping to understand what technologies exist at the moment, and what are the possible applications, getting animal welfare experts to weigh in, and using that to advocate? Should we be advocating with companies, or should we be advocating for inclusion of these certain standards and certain guardrails within AI governance frameworks? Which one of the two do you think would be more impactful to directly help the animals?
Yeah, that's a
Thank
good
you.
question. And to be cheeky, I want to say both at the same time. So we work with seafood certification standards to change their language, because we often see that certification standards might act as a prequel to different legislation requirements. But I do think that if we were able to really jump in both avenues simultaneously, that would get us the furthest with regards to safeguards in AI and animal welfare. But I do think that we are at a moment in time where we absolutely need to take stock of all of the existing technologies related to AI, what the industry is using them for, and really spend time on these opportunities and risks that exist for each different kind of technology, because there's hundreds of species that are currently being farmed. So how does it affect each one, and in what way, and in what capacity do we have to put a stop to it or slow it down, or put some kind of responsible governance requirements in any kind of mechanism that we can. So I don't know if I answered your question, but all in one.
Thank you all for an excellent panel. My question is probably mostly for you, Abby. In your research and your knowledge of the industry, do you see more an expansion of RAS, so on land, or do you also see an expansion of offshore closed containment farming systems? And what are some of the risks that you see in those types of production systems?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We're not really seeing much RAS at the moment, actually. And I have heard that the industry isn't super keen on it. And I think it is because they have very, very small profit margins. And so it's not highly profitable, very hard to get enough investment to be able to get it off the ground and then sustain it. I think they know that. So I have a feeling, I'm guessing, but I have a feeling they're kind of waiting it out trying to expand as much as they possibly can at sea now and just squeeze as much out of these animals while they can before the seas get too hot for it to even be feasible anymore, which we're close to that being a point, I think. So they're just going to try and maximize the opportunity while they can to just go wild into the current Scottish lochs. And then I think they'll inevitably have to move to on land, and so they're probably hoping by that point the technology will have improved. I think we're not seeing any signs of that improvement so far, though, so it feels like a bit of a wing and a prayer right now. I would be sweating it, if I'm honest. If I was a salmon farming company right now, I'd be panicking, because they don't have a whole lot of time left to try and figure this out. And they've been boasting for many, many years now about the high level of investment that they're putting in to research and development. They love to tell everybody that millions of pounds are going into this, but actually they're not getting any good results. We've not seen anything that's yielding success so far. And that's, of course, irrespective of all of the other ethical problems, but just from a business perspective, it doesn't seem like they have a good solution. As you kind of mentioned, they are now looking to be even further offshore. That brings a whole load of problems with its own, because yes, it will mean that they are further out and therefore the water will flow faster and therefore should, in theory, get rid of some of the lice because it's going to push the lice off the salmon. But it will also mean that these very fragile animals are having to then contend with very rough water, and so will the workers as well. The workers will be on there, and I've seen footage where they're just trying to hold on to the cages while they're being smashed around. I mean, it's really bad for the workers, really bad for the animals too. The only other one that's being considered is semi-closed containment, where essentially they have a skirt or a netting around the cages to try to contain the lice and the disease and to stop them from spreading that to the wild animals. But again, it's been proven in British Columbia not to work. So I don't really see at the moment they have any good solution, and I expect they're just going to try to do as much as they can with the existing sea pens for as long as they can before they're forced out.
Oh, that's right. Thank you. They need the microphone. Oh, to make my blood going. Yeah.
Megan. There may not be an answer to this question, but I'm interested in the potential impacts of the increase in deep sea mining, as it's going to impact ocean ecosystems generally, and in particular the so-called forage fish, right, that are often fish to bring into the aquaculture settings. So I don't know if you've seen any conversation about the connection between these two, and I'm asking because I think it's helpful to merge these two, because they're both issues that don't get enough attention.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, I know more about the mesopelagics and the impact, which are those fish that do this diurnal, huge, the last great untapped marine resource, if you would look at it from a resource management point of view, is the mesopelagic fish that go up and down during the day. You can't fish them commercially because they're kind of gelatinous and they light up. But you could compress them into fish meal. And the Norwegians are talking about doing that. Norway doesn't come out well, actually, from this. Partly because, it's historic. They've got very poor soils. They go to sea, so it's an obvious thing to do. But they're some of the first colonizers of some of the last great common pool resources that we have. And that doesn't, that would be really tragic, because we're harvesting species. At some point we've got to turn around and say enough is enough. And I think when we start doing that, that's bad. And the deep sea mining thing, every time they send a camera down on the deep sea, we find a species we haven't discovered. And at BBC, every time they do it, I've been speaking to the cameramen. Every time they do it, they get naming rights for new species, which they get very excited about. But I mean, I think we just need to take a bit of a health check on ourselves as a society and just think, okay, human beings have been around in industrial phase for about 300 years. Do we have to do everything all at once? Can't we just slow down a bit, work within our limits, start to apply some common sense to the bounds to ourselves? That's where I kind of sit on that, and I'm not sure I trust Norway to be the great arbiters of what we do in our oceans, I'm afraid.
I have a quick question if we don't have any others, and then we can wrap up.
Abby, you had lots of pictures of the campaigning work that you all are doing, and it strikes me in this room we're having this rich, nuanced conversation, but out in the world, I don't know if the general public even knows that this is happening. So what are, for you and for all of you really, what are you finding are the effective arguments with the public so that they care about this issue? What arguments can we be making to get their attention?
So I think I began a few years back thinking, I think we're all told, it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy to a degree that we say people don't care about fish. I think they do care about fish. And actually when they see our footage, they can see that there are animals here that are eaten to the bone, their skulls are protruding, they've got lice all over them, they're blind. Everyone can see that that's bad. And I think they're starting to realize these are animals, they feel pain, they bleed like humans bleed. And I think we were starting at a fairly baseline of just tell people that that's what they are, that's what they're like, and they do have qualities, and they feel pain, they feel joy. But actually, I think I've also been impressed by the media. They're constantly interested. Like, without exaggeration, our work is in BBC, Guardian, Times, The Express, pretty much on a weekly basis, because they're all so interested, not just in the footage, not just in the campaigning images, but also the data that we're gathering and all of the scandals that are unfolding here. And I think ultimately there is one part of just telling people this is the experience of these animals. It's something that's been hidden from you, deliberately as well. Just as a side note, but an important one, we actually have an ongoing court case right now because the salmon industry managed to successfully lobby DEFRA to take the word farmed off of protected geographical indication labels. So basically this label that is supposed to be something like champagne or baklava, to signal that this is a product that's come from a special place, they've taken the word farmed off. And I think that shows people you are being deliberately lied to. This is actually incredibly misleading, and it is an intentional attempt to do that. So I think pairing not only these are animals with real life experiences that you've never seen before that is hidden under the water, but also with you are being deceived, I think that's a kind of perfect combination. So just telling them the truth seems to be resonating enough.